very much. So I'm just going to do a whistle-tour stop of how to manage mycotoxins in maize, because this is going to be very much to talk about if I try and take my time. So, brief outline, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to mycotoxin, but thankfully Mark and Ewan have already introduced the topic of mycotoxins, or the concept of mycotoxins. I'm going to have a brief discussion of how mycotoxins negatively impact cow health and productivity. And then I'm going to go on a little bit about how climate change might affect mycotoxin profiles that we expect to see in geographical areas. I'm then going to go through our latest mycocheck findings from year to date for 2026. And then I'll give you some tips for a preventative approach to mycotoxin management and feed out. So without further ado, what are mycotoxins? So mycotoxins are secondary metabolites produced by fungi, and fungi will mainly produce mycotoxins when they are stressed. They can be harmful and toxic to humans and animal health. They are found in all food and feedstuffs and grains. So far, we have identified over 500 different mycotoxins. Worldwide, the WHO currently estimates that about 25% of the crops are affected annually with mycotoxins. However, we believe that figure to be a little bit higher than that, based on our current, improved methods of detection and also increased surveillance in these feeds. So what are mycotoxins? They first came to highlight in the 1960s. So mycotoxins is quite a new area of research, I quite like to say still. And so in the 1960s, 100,000 turkeys suddenly died on a farm in the UK. They suffered from neurological issues, liver problems, and eventually they narrowed down the cause due to a contaminated batch of peanuts that came from Brazil. And when they looked further into these peanuts, they actually found that the peanuts were contaminated by Aspergillus flavus, which happened to have produced a mycotoxin. Now, because these toxins compounds glowed blue and green under the UV light, and scientists were quite simple in terms of naming, they've decided to call this alpha toxin. Alpha after Aspergillus flavin toxin because it was poisonous, and B1 because one of them happened to glow blue, the other one happened to glow also blue, so it was called B2, and then G1 and G2 for fluorescent green under those conditions. However, mycotoxins have actually been around for absolutely centuries, but people just weren't aware of them. So one of the most famous examples would be St. Anthony's fire, and this happened in France, where lots of people suddenly started having limb loss, hallucinations, and nowadays we know that that was due to a contaminated batch of rye flour. Now, at the time, there was a monastery called St. Anthony, and those priests kindly took those victims suffering from the diseases in. And what they didn't realize is by switching the rye flour they were using in the bread actually meant that their ergot poisoning was being reduced because their rye flour was clean. However, from the monks' perspective, they've managed to cure some of these patients. They recovered. And so from that perspective, they were like, well, the ones we've cured, they were sinners, but they were forgiven by God. The ones that weren't cured by this, well, they didn't repent. So that was the end of that. We also now have an indication that the Salem witch trials that took place in the USA were also due to ergot poisoning, and that's because the patients who typically have ergot poisoning will have hallucinations. So the major classes of mycotoxins that we focus on are listed on this table here. Obviously within the UK, principally we are most worried about Fusarium mycotoxins, a bit of penicillin mycotoxins, but that's mainly more in the grass silage. And because we have got some guests from New Zealand, you will find that within New Zealand, they also suffer quite greatly from ergot poisoning, and therefore that will cause some of the facial eczema you may see in your sheep and your cows in New Zealand. So the other thing we need to be aware of is mast mycotoxins. So mast mycotoxins are basically mycotoxins that were in the previous table, but they have been masked by the plant. So from a plant perspective, when they have a mycotoxin within them, they want to protect themselves from the effects of the mycotoxins. So what some plant host systems actually currently do is they'll add an additional carbohydrate to the mycotoxin. That renders the mycotoxin toxicity harmless to the plant, which is great. However, most of our methods of detections are currently available. They do not test for masked mycotoxins. And the issue is when the cow obviously ingests this crop that has got masked mycotoxins within it, as part of the cow's digestive system, they will be obviously breaking down sugars and so forth to use for nutrition. Now, as soon as you break off those sugars on those masked mycotoxins, these mycotoxins suddenly become exposed. And at that point, they can exert their toxicity on the animal. So sometimes just because you have a clean mycotoxin result from your crop doesn't necessarily mean that you might not have an issue with mycotoxins. And then we've also got to start worrying about emerging mycotoxins. And because this is a maize conference, I have looked specifically for mycotoxins that are emerging for maize. And so these, looking at the literature in the last few years, these are maize silage surveys where they've looked at emerging mycotoxins. Now these mycotoxins aren't new, they've always been there. It was just that our levels of detections were hard to detect them. They're not routinely assayed, and to be fair, they weren't really found to be an issue for animals because they occurred at such a low frequency. However, we are beginning to see them more and more as climate change happens and a number of other factors. So from the literature, we can say that the emerging mycotoxins for maize are mollifermin, and that will generally cause animals to have kind of muscle weakness, respiratory failure. We've also got beavericin, and that disrupts the endocrine growth system, and therefore your animals might not be growing as well. And also fusaproliferin is appearing a lot in these mycotoxin surveys. However, there is very limited data out on this mycotoxin, so we actually don't really know what the effects it has on the animal, other than we have seen it appear more and more in maize silage samples or surveys. So what happens in the cow? So all these mycotoxins will have different effects on the cow depending on the mycotoxin you will have. So alpha-toxin obviously is a carcinogen, and it will also impair rumen function. The main problem with alpha-toxin is that when it gets metabolized by the cow, it produces alpha-toxin M1. That can go into the milk, and that might be an issue when it starts going into the milk. You've also got your formonazin and your DON, and they will cause impart rumen function. They will infect intestinal epithelial lining, cause leaky gut, and so forth. But all of these factors will hinder your productivity. You might see reduced milk yield. You might see increased mastitis. You might have a higher cell count, somatic cell count in your milk, and so forth. So those are kind of the effects you'll generally see with different mycotoxins, depending what mycotoxin you see. But then species sex also plays a role. So generally speaking, ruminants can handle mycotoxins quite well. They are geared to handle mycotoxins fairly well compared to all the other species. The pig is the most sensitive, followed by the human. And obviously, as you decrease down, as you can see, the ruminant can handle mycotoxins quite well. It has microflora within its gut that can detoxify mycotoxins quite efficiently. However, we do know that female species are more susceptible to mycotoxins and their effects compared to males, especially DON and formonazin. And we also know that depending on the sex and the mycotoxin present, you may see a different response towards immunity. So in females, we generally tend to see immunosuppression. That means that if your cows are challenged with a pathogen at the same time as a mycotoxin, they will be sick for longer, and therefore you will lose your productivity in that way because it's taking you longer to cure those animals. Whereas in the male, what you tend to see is immunostimulation, and that means that the immune system is acting more aggressively, and therefore you're diverting energy away from production into dealing with the immune response. Typically, when you see an immune activation, you would be using up to 5 to 30% of your total energy for the cow just to deal with an immune response. So generally, if ruminants are healthy, they can deal well with mycotoxin challenge. However, any additional stresses can tip that balance, because what we want is a balanced cow that can handle mycotoxins. However, there are many things that can affect and tip that balance the other wrong way. So changing the diet, and changes in the diets can affect that, because cows might not be seeing the mycotoxins they usually encounter. If you change the source or the feed, use a different ingredient, they might not be familiar with the mycotoxins that are present, so therefore they deal less well with those. Higher productivity will usually be an additional stress to the cow, and it can cause rumen dysfunction, so the additional pressure of the mycotoxins also is an added challenge. A change in environment is a stress to the cow. Disease, transition phase, heat stress, any of those can be additional stresses to the cow. And the more stresses you add to the cow, the more you tip the balance towards the cow not being able to deal with mycotoxins as efficiently as it should if it was healthy. So I touched upon alpha-toxin M1 in milk, and now the reason that we are principally concerned about alpha-toxin M1 in milk is because alpha-toxin M1 is a carcinogen. So when it is in milk above a certain degree, this is the only mycotoxin that has a max permitted level within the UK and the EU, and that is capped to at 0.05 micrograms per kilogram. Now, traditionally, the UK is viewed as a low risk of alpha-toxins, but we have some factors to consider, climate change being one of them. So in this survey of alpha-toxin milk contamination from Croatia over the last few years, from 2022 to 2024, what you can actually see that there is a peak of increase of alpha-toxin M1 above the legal limit. And in that case, if your alpha-toxin M1 is above those legal limits, the only thing you can do with that milk is dump it. And that was actually narrowed down to warmer temperatures, climate change. That year, the year before, they had really long droughts, and therefore their alpha-toxin risks in that crop increased. The other thing you've got to be aware with is imported feed. Be very aware of where your feed is coming from. I don't know if you've got any Dutch visitors here, but I'm sure the Dutch will be very aware of this. So in October 2025, 497 Dutch farmers were prohibited from delivering milk to customers without further inspection. And that was because they all were fed, or in their diets, they had a 2025 crop of French maize that was above the legal limits for alpha-toxin, and there was a risk that their alpha-toxin had then been metabolized by the cows and leached into the milk. And so therefore, there were many Dutch farmers who weren't able to sell their milk for a long period of time while additional tests were put in place. If the milk was found to be over the limit, they just had to dump it. And again, in this survey from Croatia, what you can actually see in the black here, which I've highlighted, there is also an increase in milk that has above the max allowable level, which means the milk will have to be dumped. And the researchers in that case found that was due to high levels of concentrates being fed in the diet at that time because the farmers didn't have enough feed. So imported feed is something to be aware of in terms of mycotoxin risk. And obviously, we're in our third heat wave at the moment. So climate change is something to be aware of in terms of mycotoxin risk profile. And so hopefully you've all been seeing, this was just last week's worth of newspaper articles. I've been trawling the internet to see how much talk has been on climate change, and we can say we've got the worst heat wave ever in Europe. The UK is facing its third heat wave currently, and we're all very hot, so luckily we're in air conditioning at the moment. But we also have extremities in other areas of the world, so we've got more wet weather in other geographical areas that we wouldn't traditionally see. However, the main factors that affect fungal growth is exactly a lot of the climate change factors. So on this graph, we have a report from the Climate Change Report. It gets published every every few years, so the next one will not be published until 2029. So this is the 6th edition, which is the latest version, and as you can see, they're predicting increased temperatures, increased geographical areas that are going to have more drought. They were also predicting increased carbon dioxide and methane and nitrogen oxide levels. So weather events that used to be extreme but infrequent are now considered to be becoming more and more frequent, and that is something to be aware of in terms of mycotoxins. So we are predicting, based on climate change, that in the cool, cold regions, fewer crops are going to be harvested in the hot regions, and we're going to be producing more in the cooler areas. We also predict that tropical crops are going to become optimal in subtropical regions. Maize production is predicted to reduce in Africa and southern Europe, but we expect to see an increase in maize production in Central Europe, USA, South America, and Asia because of climate change. We also predict that coffee production is going to reduce in Mexico, Brazil, and Vietnam. But the US could suddenly become a huge coffee producer. So all in all this shift in crops and production is going to cause a net migration of pests. And with the pests, mycotoxins are also predicted to shift due to not only crop rotations, because certain molds will favour certain crops, but also the climate change factors affecting them will also cause them to shift. The pests are shifting, they're moving across, so the mycotoxins will be spreading areas you may not traditionally see them. So we predict that the plant disease triangle will be shifted by climate change. We're predicting that fungal diversity is going to change in the ecosystems we are aware of. We will predict that, crop resilience and resistance is going to go up and down depending where you are, what crop you're seeing. And therefore, what we need to be aware of, that we need to respond to climate change as a measure. So can I predict what mycotoxin profile I might expect due to climate change? So I've told you alpha toxins traditionally like hot, drought kind of weathers. So my prediction is the hotter the temperatures and the longer periods of drought, that's going to increase my risk of alpha toxins in the field. Is that true? Well, if you look at this graph, this is done by Cranfield University, that does seem to be true. This bar here is at 30 degrees, the grey bar is at 37 degrees, about intermediate carbon dioxide levels, and as you see in the 37 degrees we have a higher level of alpha toxins produced. However, if you start taking humidity, moisture into account, and on this side of the graph, what you actually see is if you increase the moisture, humidity, you see a switch. So at 30 degrees, I've got more alpha toxin than at 37 degrees. And the only thing I've changed here is the humidity. So another prediction, more rain is going to increase my risk of DON in the field. It's my prediction. But actually, that's kind of works. So what you see in this graph is increasing water activity going this way, but the DON level varies. So in the blue is the DON, and in the red and the green there are metabolites of DON. So as you can see, depending on the level of moisture, you may get DON or a DON metabolite appearing more and being produced by the fungi. And that is something you need to be aware of, because 15-acetyl DON is actually more potent than DON as a toxic. So it's going to be more toxic than just having DON in your field. And that's something to be aware of. So the latest mycocheck findings for the UK from year to date so far, what we found is, okay, so grass silage, as we expect, is generally a low risk for mycotoxin, and that was true of last year and both this year. This year, maize silage, it's more risky for mycotoxins, and as you can see, we're actually seeing an increase in risk between 2025 and 2026 maize silage that we've analysed using our mycocheck service. TMR, traditionally, we can see that the risk has increased compared to last year. So last year it was in the low risk threshold. This year we're seeing it in the medium risk threshold. Interestingly, concentrates, which usually we do say is one of the more riskier raw materials you could be feeding in terms of mycotoxin risk, is actually fallen this year. So last year it was in the high risk. This year we're seeing it kind of in the medium risk level. In terms of the number of samples testing positive for at least one mycotoxin or more, we can see a similar pattern, that maize silage, about 97, 94%, over 90%, including for TMR for both years. Concentrates also above 90%, not unexpected. And as we expect, grass silage, generally very low risk of mycotoxins. And then number of mycotoxins by sample type, because mycotoxins can have synergistic effects. So we don't, depending on the combination of mycotoxins, you may see a worse effect on health or not. You can actually see that in general, your maize silage that we sampled, they're generally between 1 to 3 mycotoxins that we can see. We've got a few in the 4, a few in the 5, very rarely past 5+ toxins. Conversely, the concentrates, we actually do see the vast majority kind of falling in the more mycotoxin, increased number of mycotoxins. And in terms of the mycotoxins that we have found for the UK, principally your main risks are from the Fusarium mycotoxins, as we expect currently from, so you'll get lots of DON, ZON, Thimonazine B1, quite high levels. And actually we are starting to see some penicillium toxins as well appear, but principally I think the main risk within the UK would still be of Fusarium mycotoxins. So what can I actually do to reduce my risk? That's a question. Well, there are many factors that affect mycotoxin production, and they're all kind of there, because anything that affects how the mold grows will affect potentially how likely that mold is going to produce mycotoxins. So what can I practically do to reduce my risk? So pre-harvest, you could look at the choice of plant variety and resistant breeding. There are some crops that are resistant to Fusarium molds, so you could consider using them. You could ensure that your fertilizer rates are sufficient for the fields. Generally, we have seen research that indicated that lower nitrogen levels in the soil can increase the risk of DON contamination in the field, because that is one of the triggers that causes Fusarium to produce DON. Consider practicing crop rotation within the fields. Now, this reduces the risks of stabilizing mold populations in the field, and therefore you're de-risking mycotoxins being reduced, because you're kind of changing the ecosystem within that field. Tilling your fields, again, that reduces the risk of mold spores and mycotoxins growing and contaminating on your next harvest. Consider your sowing density. Avoid planting crops too dense, because planting crops too dense will produce humid microclimates, and that will obviously increase your risks of molds and potentially mycotoxins. Irrigation, consider, avoid irrigating during flowering and maturation stages. And you may consider the use of fungicides, weed, and insect control. One of the things we do know is that Fusarium species can colonize weed species without actually showing any symptoms on the weed. So you may have a Fusarium problem in your field, but you just can't see it if it hasn't reached your crop yet. The other thing is silage management. So ensure cutting height of harvesters are set to minimize soil contamination, and that will prevent mold coming into your crop as you ensoil. Also harvest at recommended dry matter concentrations or maturity stage. Seal and tightly pack silos rapidly after harvest to preserve anaerobic conditions, because we want to prevent oxygen getting into that clamp and allowing molds to potentially grow. Ensure a low silage pH and anaerobic conditions in clamps, so maybe consider the use of silage inoculants or oxygen barrier plastic films. Maintain a straight firm silo face during feed out to help enhance aerobic stability. And also try and feed silage immediately after removal. So it has been shown in several studies that feeding silage at a minimum rate of 10 to 16 centimetres per day in winter and 25 to 35 centimetres in summer can actually enhance aerobic stability in your clamp. Essentially, good clamp management is key to reducing the risk of mycotoxins in silage. So this is an interesting study that we're currently doing on a farm near Devon. So what we've done is we've basically monitored this maize clamp over the feed-out period, and it's still ongoing, so I've still got more results to come. And we sectored the clamp into 3 sections, so there's my left-hand side, my centre, and my right-hand side. Now this clamp, interestingly, does not have any kind of plastic barriers on the side, so that might explain some of the results we're seeing from the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the clamp in terms of the stability. But as you can see, these are the different mycotoxin profiles that we're seeing as we feed out. And what is most interesting for us at the moment is that we're starting to see really high levels of novalinol appear in the clamp on the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the clamp, but not really in the centre, during the 4th month of feed out. And we've also noted the appearance of penicillium mycotoxins in the 3rd month of feed out starting to appear. And this is potentially where the clamp was originally opened up, and then the farmer decided he moved some maize silage from another clamp, so then he resealed his silage maize clamp, and we think he might have now hit the period where he had that clamp briefly opened up feeding before he resealed that clamp. So that might also be something to consider. On farm, what can you do if you have a potential mycotoxin issue? I always say send the feed for mycotoxin analysis. Just looking at a feed, you can't tell if there is any mycotoxins, so always send in the feed if you think you might have a mycotoxin problem, so you be sure. You might consider the use of a mycotoxin binder versus a remediator. Now, binders are generally efficient for aflatoxins, but they are less efficient for the Fusarium type mycotoxins because they are traditionally harder to bind. So therefore, in a case where you may have Fusarium mycotoxins as an issue, I would consider the use of a remediator instead of a binder, because straightforwardly binding will not be efficient for those kind of mycotoxins. And you may also consider using a mycotoxin remediator in your feed as a preventative. So if you think your herd might be experiencing more stress, then use a mycotoxin remediator. You might want to use it as a general preventative strategy to decrease your risk of mycotoxins in general, because you might not know where your imported feed is coming from. And if you're unsure of the source of feed or your concentrate. So my key take-home message always for this is, if you're not sure if you've got a mycotoxin issue, send your feed in for analysis so that you are sure. And prevention is always better than trying to fix the problem after you've had it. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.